Okay. Good morning, everyone.
Buenos días a todos. Esa es la hora del café del foro. Qué bien volver acá. Es un lugar aquí para pensar en las cosas que hemos tenido conversaciones. Y yo y Mohammed hemos pensado que lo que podemos hacer una sesión de media hora en la mañana para resumir lo que hemos hecho ayer y podríamos compartir las ideas para
Would like to contribute. We had some really rich conversations last night over dinner, and so many perspectives came up that we couldn't capture, but I think would be beneficial for all of us. So if you agree, I would maybe share one or two insights. Mohammed would share a few, and then we'd open it up for folks also to share sort of their insight or question or thinking or sort of the one nugget that they would like to share with everyone. Okay, silent descent, and we get started. So my first point I wanted to share came from one of the speakers yesterday when he said it takes a village. And then the question that came to my mind is, but what happens when the village is destroyed? How do we go about going forward? And I started to unpack that metaphor, and as I started to unpack the idiom, there was so much that happened yesterday that started to feed into it. Because the first thing we have to rebuild is the capacity of the village to care for their young. And the caring of the caregivers really resonated in that regard. And right from sort of the first set of presentations we heard from Anne, who talked about sort of the frontline workers, thinking of the standard guidelines and the frontline workers and how we've got to care for them, from what Larry shared with us about these strategies for short-term mental health interventions delivered by community health workers, parenting support, and so on and so on. The theme kept coming through that, and it made me realize that when we look at, this is a picture, thanks Charlie for putting it up, that was very striking to me when I received it a while back, because it speaks so much about what happens to caregivers in this situation of conflict. And thinking through what we do in early childhood programming when we talk about parenting, we primarily focus on the adult as the parent in our parenting programs, and not so much focus on the adult in their own adult capacity and their own needs. And as I think through trying to bridge programming for development and humanitarian contexts, and trying to adapt our current effective programs to work in humanitarian contexts, what emerged for me yesterday was the adaptations we need to make to our current parent support interventions, where we need to understand them as parents, but also as adults themselves, especially in situations like this, where their needs really have to be met in order for them to also be parents. So that to me was a very, very big takeaway. And I reached out to a few colleagues last night who are working in some of these contexts to ask if we can already start to think about how do we adapt some of the parenting packages we have. Because I think that for the field of early childhood, this would be something that's going to take us into humanitarian programming for young children in a way that is quite resonant. So that was sort of my programmatic takeaway yesterday from what we heard through the series of comments. And my unanswered, I also just want to share one unanswered question, which is, I still feel there's a long distance to travel to reach the policy table when the conversations are on peace and security and humanitarian work and reduction of violence, and I still feel we have a way to go, and I'm not sure we're quite there. So to me, that's still an open area for which actually we need more work. So I look forward to that. And to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pia. Good morning. Again, our attempt to recap yesterday, I think it's in many ways, very subjective, and we hope to get from you some more reaction so we can have in the basket of recapping more perspectives. In addition to the 2 points, really what remains with me is from the session, particularly moderated by Rima, the notion of failed state, and how can you really work on a policy when the state failed or weak policy system. How can you expect from the system that has very little capacity to implement or even generate policies? And that also was mentioned in the Lebanese case in a number of ways. But for me, the main point I wanted to share with you, if I'm asked about Amman meeting and early childhood development and education, is the context of the conflict. And I'm a conflict expert in that sense, so for me, this is really the unique part. And I was not with you in Prague or in other meetings of the forum, but I think the environment and the harsh, the brutal setting in which early childhood development is taking place was very evident in every panel yesterday. It was a thread that gone through the morning all the way until the personal stories at the end of the day. Every testimony that we've heard had a cry for, look how hard my situation is. Look how difficult where I am working, Don't expect from me too much. Don't expect policy. Don't expect peace. Don't expect this. I'm just struggling in providing the basic capacities because the context is very difficult and the conflict is overwhelmingly taking over my sometimes personal or professional capacities to cope with the situation. So that's really something that came back to us in various ways. And what I thought it really, with the link to peace building, the second point I want to make, I still think we have not made as much progress as we can on the systematic way of linking dialogue, peace building, diversity, pluralism as an integral part of the early childhood development operation as an agency. And I was thinking about it, why is it? And Ilham Nasser works on intentionality and a book on early childhood development. And I thought that's really what's needed also from other peace building places is the intentionality of the practitioner to look and integrate peace values into the operation. And that really, I don't know how to do that. I know how to do that in other areas, but not in early childhood development. I have not worked as extensively in that area. Finally, with the point in the same area of the intentionality to integrate peace building and integrate these nice values of dialogue, I thought that there must be some ways we can begin to explore maybe tangible ways that some experiment, and we've heard some stories about that, whether it's from Lebanon, the Adyan in the session we did on interreligious dialogue, or the personal story from Kifaya at the end of the day in a group one we were sitting here when she said, I intentionally teach my children as a Syrian refugees living in Jordan that forgiveness, reconciliation, and mercy of others is a necessary thing to believe in for our survival. And she is somebody who is a refugee who does that. And I thought that's an example of really some of the heroic stories that we've heard yesterday of early childhood development people who are intentionally articulating their positive hope and other aspects. My question usually, my last point about what is missing, not missing, where I think we struggled, we scratched the surface on religion. And I'm going to reiterate at least this point for me. It will be very difficult to make any progress on early childhood development and education for pluralism and coexistence and living together in this region and in a conflict area like this without understanding ways how to engage with the religious communities and religious leadership and institution. And I think we still have a long way to go as a community here in how to establish that dialogue. I feel that we speak two totally different languages, and I hope in other situations we can have a response to that. I think we're ready to go to that.
Yes, thank you so much. With those sort of reflections, we would also invite forum members and other participants to share their reflections on yesterday. Misoon, please.
Thanks. Good morning, and thanks Pia and Muhammad for this opportunity. Yesterday was a very intense day. We got to see a lot of experiences, and we've learned a lot from the research that was presented in the first session. That was a very strong session. We've got to meet a lot of people, exchange ideas, learn about programs. We've heard from the field also. So yesterday was very rich, and a lot of information came from yesterday. So now it's a very big challenge for the forum and the members and everybody to put those into action. So how do we go from this information and put it in an action? This is going to be a challenging task, I think, for the forum to take forward. Yesterday, the whole day, we were discussing the issue of peace building, and we were referring to the matter of refugees and the refugee crisis. Particularly, we were talking about the Syrian crisis all the time. I just felt that when we talk about early childhood and peace building, we should, it's good to give now the attention to the Syrian crisis, but we should also discuss it beyond the Syrian crisis, you know. In the Arab region and in other regions, peace building in early childhood is a need, whether there is a Syrian crisis or not. So let's not link it all the time with the Syrian crisis. I was wondering yesterday about all what we've heard, how can we align what we're doing here with other global initiatives taking place now? There is now like the UNESCO is leading the Rethinking Initiative. The Secretary General is leading the Education First Initiative, the Global Citizenship Education, violence prevention also. So how do we align and include an ECD component among all the global initiatives taking place is one of the recommendations we have to take care of. That's all quickly. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
Thank you. Yesterday we spent quite a bit of time in the general session talking about hope and what does hope really mean and the content of hope. And then in the afternoon in the small group session that I attended, we heard from Hamza, who spent quite a bit of time talking about his journey now as a 20-year-old from Syria coming to Jordan. And while he had faced many tragedies, I think the thing that weighed on him most heavily was the loss of his dream to become an engineer, or the stifling of his dream to become an engineer. And he talked about his challenges in completing his high school education, which had been fractured in the middle. And it became very clear that really that was his greatest hope, was education. And even if his current circumstance was less than what he had dreamed, the idea of curtailing his education was really something that represented his hope for the long term and for the future. And so for me, at least, it emphasized how much education as a whole is really the premise for hope for many people. And even for early childhood, while of course a young child may not conceptualize it in that way, that young child's education may in fact be the only hope a parent can hold for the future as well.
Thank you. Yes, Steve?
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, there's a couple of reflections I had. One was that the total sort of impact and pervasiveness of violence on individuals, on families, communities, and on economies, and that, you know, while the emphasis has been on current crises, particularly in this region, that these have been going on repeatedly in many places around the world for decades and decades and decades. And you know, we know how violence rewires the developing brain of the child and makes that brain itself react and become more violent in some ways. And so do we have the ability now to try and break those cycles of violence by emphasizing the importance of focusing on early childhood and stop the repeated cycles that have been occurring? I think the other one was that there are examples that we heard yesterday of how interventions are working, even under conditions where governments are not strong, but that requires looking at other agencies, looking at communities and looking at the religious leadership to try and support some of those. And then finally, I thought I was taken in the breakout session that I was at in the afternoon, how the violence and crises are causing a breakdown in healthcare delivery that is impacting children, but also impacting the societies to which the refugees come in through the lack of immunization that then threatens the health of the local societies. And I think finally, the idea that these massive moves of people, of refugees, and the stigma that the word refugee gives to those people, and if these movements of people are not going to be temporary, if they're going to be prolonged, are we better off trying to integrate those people into the communities, not as refugees, but as productive members of the community, and that maybe the sooner we start doing that, the better.
Thank you.
Can I come in? Yeah. I was just reflecting on what were the takeaways for me as we come to the end of this workshop. And in a more specific terms or more macro terms, I was thinking about what does one learn from this. It's been a tremendous workshop, especially yesterday's sessions were very, very educative and thought-provoking. One of the lessons that I pick up from here is that I think when there is a crisis, when there is a conflict, at least that was my understanding, that survival and immediate care comes first, and schooling and preschooling can come later because that can be deferred. But what one understood was that that itself is therapeutic for kids. And therefore there has to be some sort of a simultaneous provision for both, because even the experience of coming away from the parents, from the home, and being able to be in a space which is more safer, which is more happier, is very, very therapeutic apparently. So that itself was one takeaway that I had. Related to that was that there was this presentations about the kind of curriculum that is there for early childhood, which is adapted to be able to help the children to come to terms with their realities. So it would be very useful from the experience of Amman and other places here to really understand what are the kind of adaptations needed to be made in the curriculum to be able to provide that kind of a safe and therapy and a cathartic environment for the kids. The third, of course, was the care of caregivers, which is so critical. Basically, I would even like to suggest that the parent who was here yesterday, who was sharing her approach to parenting during this crisis situation, I think we should do a case study of that and be able to circulate it, as a kind of very good instruction for parents and for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. I know we have many responses, at least 2 or 3 that we promised to give you. Can you please just hold those to the after 3 hours, and then when we come to debrief at the end, I promise I'll negotiate a chance for us to come back to you, because we have our guest and keynote speaker waiting for us. So although we started late, but I would really appreciate if you keep them. We'll come back to them in the end. Okay? So I am going to transit with yes. So we are lucky and honored to have one of the really both well-known speaker and the analyst of the macro political dynamic and institutional policies in the region. Rami Khouri is an internationally syndicated political columnist and a book author. He was the first director and is now senior fellow at the Essam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. He also served as a non-resident senior fellow at the Kennedy School of Harvard University. He's an editor-at-large and former executive editor of the well-known Beirut-based Daily Star newspaper and was awarded the Pax Christi International Peace Prize. Rami is really, for many of us who live in the U.S., a familiar voice in many of the media and podiums of both policy and reflection on the Middle East. Thank you for agreeing, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Muhammad, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here and for all that you do, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you, and I'm sure I will learn from the rest of the sessions this morning. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you more for the previous 2 days, but I had too many commitments in Beirut, but I made sure to be able to come for this last session and to learn from your closing sessions as well. I can't tell you anything about investing in children. You're the experts on that. But what I can tell you about is the environment in which these children are born and are growing up and are maturing. And some of these people that we call children are actually adults at the age of 10 or 12 years old. There was a report released 2-3 days ago by UNICEF on regional condition and national condition of Syrian children because of the 5 years of fighting in Syria. And if you haven't seen it, just go to the UNICEF regional website and take a look at the executive summary. It's quite startling that you have kids who are 5-6 years old who are working to bring in some money. You have, and not just begging on the streets, some of them are working as delivery boys or whatever. And you have young girls at the age of 11 and 12 not just getting married, but also giving birth. And this is obviously an extreme situation. Not very many people are doing this, but there are, it's more than 10 or 20 people who are in this situation. And it is an indicator, it's a red light, of the very difficult situation that exists and the trends that may continue to evolve. So in my 20 minutes, I will basically talk about 3 points which we agreed upon when we discussed this, is the problems and the vulnerabilities that face children and youth, the situation about youth realities and perceptions and responses the world is seen by young people, and finally some comments on the research and policy linkages and the policy recommendations or policy issues that should be taken into consideration by everybody, by governments, private sector, UN agencies, NGOs, educators, religious leaders, civil society. Everybody has to be involved in addressing this issue. So let me very quickly, in the limited time I have, make some general comments. We'll have a brief Q&A, and I'll be here till the end of your morning and happy to chat with anybody or this afternoon. The reality of this generation, this cohort of young people, and we're talking of young people, say, up to the age of 14 or something like that, very young people. The reality is that this is the first generation of young people that was born into a situation of simultaneous hopelessness and rebellion by their adult by their parents and by their older siblings. The last 5 years have been an extraordinarily important turning point in the modern history of the Arab world and the Middle East. And it's not an accident that this is the 100th year now of this last tumultuous century that started in 1915, which has been rather traumatic and tumultuous all over the Arab world. And it's not an accident that 5 years ago we started to have these major uprisings, and now we have 4 or 5 countries embroiled in civil wars and serious domestic tensions, because the conditions that prevailed over the last century never, and I say never, truly gave citizens in any Arab country full citizenship rights. We never had an Arab country where the consent of the governed was an institutional imperative and a structural component of statehood. We never had a situation where public power and authority vested in different kinds of national leaderships was ever fully defined and validated in a meaningful way by the citizenry. We had citizens whose lives improved, significantly improved, from 1915 till around 1980. There was an incredible developmental spree, but in the 80s it kind of stabilized, and it's been going downhill ever since, and you measure it in any measure that you want. You can see the decline, but the biggest measure is, I would say, 3 things. Well, 4 things. We had, starting in the 1980s, a mass immigration of the youngest and brightest people in the Arab world. They just left. They went to London, to New York, to Australia. Some of them went to Dubai, which is in the Arab world, but sort of different in the Arab world, but as you know. But they gave them opportunities that they didn't have at home. The second indicator was mass support for the Muslim Brotherhood, nonviolent, peaceful Islamist movements. The third indicator was the uprisings of 5 years ago that are still going on now in different forms, mass citizen discontent, unprecedented across the whole region. And the fourth indicator, and the most ugly, was the rise of the so-called Islamic State and everything that it represents, and the continued expansion of Al-Qaeda in pockets all over the region. So there was 4 very, very clear indicators, and you had to be blind to miss them. And in fact, the prevailing power structures in the Arab world, the foreign donors, the international powers who supported the Arab systems, were blind. They didn't see what was going on. They didn't look beneath the surface of GNP, annual growth indicators, and therefore they missed these signs. And these signs have been with us for almost 40 years now, since the mid-1970s. And this is the first generation now of young kids that is growing up in this context in which this order of the last 100 years has started to fragment seriously and to collapse in some places. And young people see their parents or their older siblings today either demonstrating on the streets or fighting in civil wars or giving up the attempt to create more democratic, participatory, and accountable societies, or desperately fleeing to Europe and risking death at sea, because the risk of death at sea is less than the risk of death at home in your own country, where you're being bombed either by your own government, regional powers, rebel groups, or foreign great powers. The situation in Syria is astounding. It's the situation where every major regional power in the Arab world and non-Arab world, including Turkey and Iran and Saudi Arabia, every major opposition group in Syria, every major great power, the US, England, Russia, France, are actively fighting with their armaments in northern Syria. It's an astounding situation, but it's no surprise. It's the culmination, as the Islamic State is no surprise, it's the culmination of a tumultuous and largely unstable century